Okay, thanks so much, Lynn, and thanks everybody for tuning in. Like Lynn said, today's topic is copyright and fair use in academic settings. Fair use is one of the exceptions to copyright, and it's the thing that allows for a lot of the uses that we make of copyrighted materials in academic settings. So we'll get into a lot more detail about that in a little bit. Today we're going to start, before we get into fair use, I'd like to start by giving you a brief overview of copyright. So what is copyright? So copyright law comes from Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which gives Congress the power to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for a limited time to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. So we want to take note right at the beginning here that the original intent behind giving copyright to authors in the first place was to promote progress in knowledge. It's about social good, not primarily about money. And in fact, the Supreme Court has said that the primary objective of copyright is not to reward the labor of authors, but to promote the progress of science and useful arts. So a few more details about copyright. Copyright protects original works of authorship. So this could be a novel or a piece of music, but also more casual creations like letters and emails and photographs, even blog posts and posts on social media. So what does it mean for a work to be original? For a work to be original, it has to meet two criteria. The first is independent creation. It can't be copied from another work. And the second is that it has to exhibit at least a small amount of creativity. The creativity required here is really very low. One of the big cases here says that the phone book isn't creative enough, but that's a pretty low bar. So originality, there are some things that originality does not require. It does not require novelty, unlike in patent law. So if you were to independently sit down and come up with the Ode on a Grecian Urn without having ever read Keats's original, there's a possibility you could copyright it. But in practice, that lack of novelty can be used to rebut an assertion of independent creation. But novelty is not strictly required. Originality also does not require that the work be artistic or well executed. The courts exercise what they call aesthetic neutrality. So the quality of the work is not really relevant, and judges aren't experts in judging art, and they don't want to be art critics. So there's also no requirement that the work be lawful. So that's a difference from trademark law. So the work could be obscene, libelous, or even fraudulent and still potentially be protected by copyright. You might run into some other legal issues, but copyright might not be one of them. So facts and ideas, they're not copyrightable. However, a particular way of expressing those facts and ideas is copyrightable. So if you were to tweet saying that today it's raining in Charlotte, that is a fact and you can't copyright it. But if you were to express that fact in a creative way, like writing a song or a poem about it, that would be copyrightable. And this is what we call the idea expression dichotomy. So another thing to note is that facts and ideas, they're not copyrightable even if it was really hard to uncover them. So in some countries, they do offer copyright protection based on what's called the sweat of the brow, protection based on hard work, even if you're talking about facts and ideas. But in the US and most other common law countries, we don't offer copyright protection just because it was hard to discover some facts, or to use the previous example, just because it was hard to gather all the numbers and put them in the phone book. In order to be protected with a copyright, works also have to be what we call fixed in a tangible medium. So that tangible medium can be a traditional format like a paper or canvas, but it could also be the memory card on your camera or your phone or the hard drive on your computer or even in the cloud. Generally, copyright lasts for the life of the author plus 70 years. There are different rules for works of corporate authorship and anonymous works, but generally 70 years is the number you want to keep in mind. That number has really increased over the years. At the founding of our country, it was 14 years with a possible renewal of another 14 years. And we really have Disney and Mickey Mouse to thank for those extensions. So copyright holders have a number of exclusive rights. That includes the right to reproduce and distribute and publicly display their works and to create derivative works. So that would be the right to perform a play, sell copies of a book, or authorize someone to make a translation. So you can see that without fair use and other exceptions, those copyright rights would be absolute. So if you wanted to use, for example, an image in a presentation or an excerpt in an article, you would need to ask permission from the copyright holder and then pay whatever fee that person required. So it's good for us that fair use allows limited uses of copyrighted material without permission from the copyright holder. So we'll get into fair use in just a minute, but first I thought it would be useful to talk a little bit about how copyright is dealt with at UNC Charlotte in particular. So copyright at UNC Charlotte is governed by the copyright policy, which is policy number 315. This policy addresses ownership rights of faculty and EHRA employees, as well as SHRA employees, independent contractors, and students. So for faculty and EHRA employees who are creating works that are within the course and scope of their employment, copyright ownership is going to turn on whether the work was created at the direction of university supervisors or relying on exceptional use of university resources. So a little bit more about faculty and EHRA employees. So non-directed works are pedagogical, scholarly, literary, or aesthetic works that are created by faculty or EHRA employees resulting from a non-directed effort, so not directed by the university. So for these works, the employee owns the copyright, and there's a non-exclusive, royalty-free license, what we call a NERF license, to the university. So by contrast, directed works are specifically funded or created at the direction of the university. So in order for a work to be a directed work, you have to have a department chair or the head of an administrative unit inform the faculty or staff member in writing in advance of the creation of the work that the work is a directed work. So for those works, the university owns the copyright with the option of a NERF license to the employee. And the final category here is where there's been exceptional use of university resources. So this is where the university provides support for the creation of the work with resources of a degree or in nature that are not routinely made available to faculty or EHRA non-faculty employees in a given department or unit. The use of the university resources is presumed not to be exceptional unless a department chair or director of a unit informs the faculty member in writing before the resources are allocated that the use is going to be considered exceptional. And in those cases, the university owns the copyright with the option of a NERF license to the employee. Okay. So things are slightly different for SHRA employees and independent contractors. Here, most work is considered what we call work for hire and is owned by the university unless there's a written agreement otherwise. The work of independent contractors is also considered work for hire, and the copyright is owned by the university unless agreed otherwise. And students are also treated a little bit differently from other categories of potential copyright holders. Students retain ownership of their student works, like papers, species, creative works, that sort of thing, with a non-exclusive royalty-free license to the university. One distinction there, though, is that work they create during the course and scope of student employment is work for hire and owned by the university. And it's also worth noting that students' notes from classroom and laboratory lectures can't be used for commercial purposes. So that's a little detour into copyright at UNC Charlotte specifically. And now we're going to switch gears and talk about fair use. Okay, so in order to determine whether your proposed use of copyrighted material is fair, you have to weigh 4 factors. These are very case-specific, and they're not meant to be exhaustive. Also, not all of these factors have to be in favor of fair use in order for your use to be fair. This is basically a risk analysis, and each situation and each proposed use is going to be a little bit different. We also want to note that different people may come to different conclusions about the same set of facts, and they often do. But the important thing is to conduct a reasoned analysis that covers all 4 factors. So here we have an overview of the 4 factors to consider. So first is the purpose and character of the use. Second is the nature of the original copyrighted work. Third is the amount and substantiality of the portion you're using in relation to the whole. And fourth is the effect of the use on the market for the original. So now we're going to go into a little bit more depth on each of these factors. Okay, so factor 1 is the purpose and character of the use. So this includes whether the use is of a commercial nature or is it for nonprofit educational purposes. There are some types of uses that are likely to be fair under this factor. Educational nonprofit uses such as teaching, research, scholarship, criticism and commentary, parody, and news reporting are favored here. We also favor what we call transformative uses. So the Supreme Court has said that the question on transformative use is whether the new work, does it just supersede the objects of the original, or does it add something new with a further purpose or different character, altering the first with new expression, meaning, or message. So the Second Circuit Court of Appeals recently looked at the HathiTrust and Google Books repositories, and they found that creating a full-text searchable database of books, some of which were in copyright, was a transformative use, in part because the purpose of those databases was new. It was transformative. They were preserving the books and indexing them, and in the Google Books case, they were providing some small snippets of text around the search terms, but they weren't providing the entire text. So that's a very different purpose from the purpose behind the writing of the original books. Another lower court found that a search engine's use of thumbnails of copyrighted images was okay because the purpose was transformative, giving access to information versus the artistic expression and purpose of the original. In another case, a book about the Grateful Dead used thumbnails of concert posters in a timeline about the band. So here the purpose of the use was found to be transformative because it was giving the history of the band rather than the original purpose of the posters, which was to advertise concerts. So that's just a few examples of how courts should look at this first factor. The first factor is super important in the fair use analysis. And the good thing for us is that educational uses and nonprofit uses like the ones involved in teaching and research tend to be favored in the analysis. Okay, so factor 2 looks at the nature of the original copyrighted work. Under this factor, the use of factual content such as nonfiction and news is more likely to be a fair use, and the use of creative works and unpublished works is less likely to be fair. the Supreme Court has said that the law generally recognizes a greater need to disseminate factual works than works of fiction or fantasy. Okay, so factor 3 is the amount and substantiality of the portion that you're using in relation to the copyrighted work as a whole. So you might hear people referring to a 10% or one chapter rule, but those are not legal rules, they're more rules of thumb. So the amount that you use still needs to be appropriate for the specific use that you're making of it under the specific circumstances. But generally using a small amount that's appropriate for a favored educational nonprofit use is more likely to be considered a fair use. So you should be looking at whether you're using no more than necessary to achieve your pedagogical purpose. So this factor is both quantitative and qualitative. So it looks at both the actual amount you're using as a fraction of the whole and also how substantial that is. So if you take a small part that could be considered the heart of the work, you might not be engaging in a fair use even if it's very small. So the Second Circuit has pointed out that the third factor does not necessarily weigh against fair use even where an entire work is being copied. So there's no categorical rule against that if the other factors are met, though of course it's less likely that that's going to be fair. Okay, so factor 4. The final factor here is the effect of the use upon the market or a potential market for the value of the original copyrighted work. So if there is no significant effect on the market, this factor is likely to support fair use. On the other hand, if the use replaces a sale of the original copyrighted work, it's less likely to be considered fair. So it's probably okay here for there to be some small amount of market harm. The court in the Google Books case, for example, said the effect on the market has to be meaningful or significant, and the possibility of some loss of sales is not enough to find against fair use. The question is whether the rights holder is being deprived of significant revenues. So the important question to ask here is, are you copying the original just to avoid buying a copy? So that's all the fair use factors, and I think a good way to get a grasp of how they work in practice is to look at a few examples. So next we're going to turn to a few hypothetical real-life situations just to see how these work out in practice. And I'm hoping you guys can participate by typing in the chat or unmuting your microphone and giving me an idea of what you think about these hypotheticals. Okay, so our first example, we have a professor who has found a copy of an out-of-print book. It's very important in her field and relevant to a course she's teaching. She wants to make a copy and put it on reserve in the library. So do you think this is a fair use? So I've got the 4 fair use factors over here to the right. So what do you think about factor 1? Does anyone have an intuition about that? So we probably would say that this, this is a nonprofit educational use. So under the first factor, this would probably lean towards fair use. And that second factor, does anybody have thoughts about that? Anybody?
And Kate, just to, we can also have the participants do one of the check mark for maybe like acceptable under fair use, and then the red X as well. Then you can talk about that. But of course, anyone's willing to unmute their mic and talk if they want to contribute.
Yeah. Okay, that sounds great. So yeah, if you feel like using the check mark instead, that would work too. But okay, so factor 2, I haven't given you any details about this book, but what would make a difference here? It's important that the book has been published previously. it makes some difference that it's a work of fiction, so that would make the fair use argument slightly less compelling. But we can say here that it's previously published, so that does favor fair use. Factor 3, this is a little bit more challenging here because she is copying the entire book. But sometimes you do need to use the entire original in order to achieve your favored educational purpose. So this factor 3 doesn't necessarily weigh against fair use here. And factor 4 is the effect on the market. So here it's out of print, so we really don't have much of a market to interfere with. So what do we think? Do you want to use the check mark to say if you think it's fair use and the X to say if you think it's not? What do you think, Lynn?
They're doing it. If you look down at their names yet.
Great. Okay. Yeah, so I'm seeing probably more check marks than X's, and I would tend to agree. I think there's a strong argument for fair use here based on all those factors. Of course, now if she were to make this copy available on the internet, that would change things significantly because that would take away that educational purpose because anybody could see it. Okay, so let's move on to another example. So here we have a professor. She's wanting to save her students some money, so she scans an in-copyright sociology textbook and posts it on the course Canvas site in its entirety. Do we think this is fair use? So we'd start by looking at factor 1. Here we do have the educational nonprofit purpose here. Factor 2, we would say the original is published and it's nonfiction, so those both would favor fair use. The factor 3 here is where we would get into some trouble because she is copying the entire textbook. And factor 4 is probably where this fair use argument this would be the sticking point, because the point of scanning and posting the text would be to keep students from having to buy the textbook, which would interfere with the market. So what do we think? You can use the check mark and the X. Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of X's. And I think that's right. This is probably not a fair use. But how could we make the fair use claim stronger here? Maybe by posting just one chapter. Of course, that would depend on the length of the entire book. But posting as little as possible to make your pedagogical point, of course, helps with the fair use argument.
Before continuing, Kate, Bobby Hobgood had a question on our last slide. I don't know if it's still applicable, Bobby.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Can you hear me? Oh, okay, great. Can we actually go back to that last slide? I've tried to refresh my memory on
the out-of-print book.
So the thing that I wonder about here is what happens if you PDF this and put it, we didn't talk about the Canvas course, but if you put it in your Canvas course, because one of the concerns I have is even if it's okay for your students for that use, when you put something out there electronically, even if it's in your Canvas course, students can download it and then they could disseminate it outside of that quote-unquote closed environment.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, I think it's possible to make things like that not downloadable or just, you can just read it online. That would certainly help. But I think the fact that, generally speaking, the fact that it's only available to students registered in the class, even if they can print it out or disseminate it. That really does help with the fair use argument as compared to just putting it on the internet where anybody can access it.
Right. So there's a distinction then of the individual who makes something available as fair use, but then I'm wondering how do things change when someone who's received this secondhand then disseminates it? You see what I'm saying? So they're taking it out of its original intent was as a part of a course, a curriculum. But then if the student takes it out and then disseminates it, what is the responsibility of that instructor? Is that clear?
Yeah, that's clear. I would say it's going to depend. It's going to be a case-by-case analysis, obviously, but generally making the students aware of the copyright limitations would help. But the student would be doing their own, I guess, technically they'd be doing their own fair use analysis as far as further dissemination, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Okay, so let's see. So let's do another example. This is a real-life example here. So here we have a collage artist who uses pieces of other artists' works, cuts them up, adds his own imagery to create a new work. So in one work, he's taking an entire photograph from a photographer's published collection and adding images and shapes on top of that photograph. So do we think this is a fair use? It's going to depend a lot on the context, of course. But what is your instinct here? I'm seeing a lot of X's. I don't know if those are left over from the previous question or not. Oh, here we go. I'm seeing some check marks. So let's go through the 4 factors here. So factor 1, purpose and character of the use. We can't necessarily say that this is nonprofit or educational in nature because we don't know whether he's wanting to sell his work. So really we want to look at whether the new work is transformative. Does it have a new meaning or message? And that's going to depend a lot on the context. Factor 2, if the original is creative, we do lean a little bit away from fair use. The fact that it was previously published does help with the fair use argument. And factor 3, he is using the entire original, so we want to ask whether he needs that entire amount in order to achieve a transformative purpose under factor 1. And factor 4, we want to look at whether his use is interfering with the market for the original. So is anyone going to be buying this new work instead of the old work? What do you guys think? I'm seeing kind of a mix, which is probably the right answer. We need more information, basically. But this example I've given you comes from an existing case, Cariou versus Prince. In that case, Cariou had taken photos while he was living with a group of Rastafarians for 6 years, and he published a collection of those photos. And Prince, who's a famous appropriation artist, took several of those photos and added additional layers to them. The court in that case found that some of the works were transformative and some were maybe not, because they didn't have enough of a new purpose, meaning, or message. They didn't change the original enough. So here is actually an example of that. So on the left here, you have an example of one that did not satisfy fair use. So he didn't make that much change to the original. So the court said, we are not sure, but we don't think this is fair use, and we're going to send it back down to the lower court. On the right is one that the court said did satisfy fair use. So you see the picture at the bottom right of that right hand. That's the original photo, and then he's really changed it a lot. He's added a lot of drawing and additional images. So you can see that this really does get case specific, and the courts are asked to make kind of hard judgments about what constitutes a transformed use. Oh, and I see yeah, I see a comment here that it would depend on whether the artist is selling the art, and that's absolutely true, whether it's nonprofit or not. And in this case, Prince was selling his works for millions of dollars, while Carey had just published an expensive collection of photographs. So let's try another example. Here we have a group of students making a documentary about the civil rights movement. The film comprises clips of speeches by Martin Luther King as well as other activists to show how the movement evolved over time. So do we think this is a fair use of those speeches? So we can start with factor one. We do think probably this is an educational nonprofit use. It's a group of students. Also, we can probably say that the use is transformative. The purpose of the original speeches was to effect political change, whereas the purpose of the documentary is to tell the story of the civil rights movement. So this really is a new and transformed purpose. Factor two, the nature of the original. Depending on the speech, these may be considered published or unpublished. And this depends on a number of things, including the audience and the circulation. Factor three, they are just using clips to illustrate certain points. So not using the entire work, just using enough to get their educational purpose across. And factor four, do you think this interferes with the market for the original? Probably not. Probably people aren't going to be going to this documentary as a complete substitute for the original. But what do you guys think? Do you think this is a fair use? Do you want to use your check and X boxes? X boxes. So it looks like everybody thinks this is a fair use, and I think that's probably right. This example does illustrate, though, the importance of knowing who your copyright holder is. Martin Luther King's estate is notoriously very litigious about copyright, which is why it's hard to find a video of the entire I Have a Dream speech online, and documentarians have encountered some challenges in trying to get permission to use King's speeches. But little clips here and there in a documentary like this, we think that probably would be a fair use. Okay, and one more example here. So here we have a local animal shelter that's trying to raise money for the shelter, as well as awareness about homeless animals. So they create a promotional video in which shelter volunteers lip sync and dance to ABBA's song, Take a Chance on Me, and they post it on YouTube. Do you think this is a fair use? So going through the analysis, we would start with factor one, and this is definitely nonprofit. The animal shelter in question is nonprofit. Factor two, the nature of the original. It is highly creative. It's also published, though, so that creativity would weigh against fair use, whereas being published, it does weigh in favor of fair use. Factor three, they are using the entire original, but is this more than they need to achieve their protected purpose under factor one? Probably not. Factor four, is it possible this their use could interfere with the market for the original? Possible that someone could turn on the YouTube video and just listen to the sound instead of buying the song, but yeah, that could kind of go either way. So what do you guys think? Do you think this is a fair use? I'm seeing lots of, we're evenly divided here, it looks like. Well, this is actually a real case. Let's see. I'm going to post a link here in the chat if you guys want to watch that. It's actually the Wake County SPCA made this video. It's really adorable. But so they did post it online, thinking it would just be viewed by not very many people, but it kind of became viral, and they got a cease and desist letter from Sweden. They tried to work something out, but ABBA's lawyers refused, so they took it down. So now the versions that are available online are pirated. So this illustrates the point that even if you might have a good fair use argument, it's still expensive to defend yourself in court. So they just ultimately took it down and dropped the case. And yeah, this one could kind of go either way, but it's an interesting local-ish example. Okay, so that hopefully gives you a better idea of how fair use works and some of the situations where you might encounter it. And at the end here, I wanted to touch quickly on a couple of related points. So one is in situations where you don't feel like you're safely in fair use territory with your proposed use of copyrighted material. This doesn't necessarily mean you're out of luck, because you can always ask for permission. Permission doesn't have to take any particular form, and it can even be given orally or over the phone, etc. But I would encourage you to get permission in writing so that you have it for records, your own records or your publishers. Some things to include in your permission letter would be to identify yourself and your institution, emphasizing that you're nonprofit and educational, identify the portions of the work you want to use specifically, describe your proposed use, including changes you want to make, and emphasizing again the nonprofit educational purpose, and also probably your lack of funding for licensing fees. Describe any restrictions you'll place on the audience. So is it only going to be available on campus, only available in your class? Request contact information for other rights holders, and offer to provide attribution and ask for their preferred format for attribution. And another option, if all else fails, is to look for openly licensed materials online. So some materials are going to carry a Creative Commons license, and depending on the type of license, you can do different things with the materials under different conditions. The least restrictive will be CC BY, which means you just have to give attribution to the original creator, and they get more restrictive from there. But educational uses are always easier to justify. Another option is to find openly licensed materials through Google. For example, Google has an option in its advanced image search where you can search by usage rights. So you can search for images that are free to use or share commercially or non-commercially. You can also search for an article you want in Google Scholar, and you'll often find a PDF version of that article in an institutional repository. And finally, you can always provide links to licensed materials without generally encountering issues with copyright, provided that the site you're linking to is, you don't have any reason to think that the material is posted there illegally. Okay, so that is copyright and fair use in a nutshell. So we have a little bit of time at the end here for questions. If you have any follow-up questions for this. Also, just to reiterate, I'm available if this has sparked any specific questions with regard to your work. I'm always available, and I actually think I have my, yes, this is my contact information. So if this has raised any questions, or if questions come up in the future, I would love to hear from you. That's what I'm here for, so please do get in touch. But we have a few minutes here if anyone has any questions related to this presentation. Okay, I did see one question. What are the parameters of a NERF license? That's a great question. So NERF is non-exclusive, royalty-free. So if you're giving someone a NERF license, it's just allowing them to use that work without paying any royalties, but it's also not exclusive. So you're not giving that person the exclusive right to use that work, just the right to use that work in addition to other people, in addition to yourself, and without them paying royalties. Okay, we have a question. What if, referring to the ABBA animal shelter, hypothetical. What if they had sung the song themselves? And yeah, I think that would help the fair use argument, because it is making it, it's just helping with that transformational argument a bit. Covers of songs they're a little bit treated a little bit differently. The law treats them a little bit differently, so there would be other considerations there. But yeah, as far as, oh yeah, no, they were lip syncing. So yeah, so that would singing it themselves would change it a little bit for sure. And it certainly would have changed whether the YouTube algorithm had picked it up in the first place as a copyrighted work. It might not have become such a big deal. But yeah, that would change it a bit.
Okay. It looks like Bobby has a question.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks again, Kate. This was great.
Thank you.
I think that increasingly, as we have access to productivity tools and content via the internet, I think we need more workshops like this for faculty and students to understand the ins and outs of copyright. First, a comment and then a question. My first comment was with respect to the music example that you used. We actually had an issue with this in our department where a faculty person, I helped create a promotional video, and this person wanted to use a copyrighted piece of music. Not the whole thing, but just maybe a minute or so of a 4-minute piece of music. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, because here at the university, we have to post everything on YouTube, anything that's going to be available and promoting the university. We could not do that because, as you mentioned, the YouTube algorithm would take that down.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to reinforce that that's a really slippery slope, and if anyone's thinking of any kind of publicity material using a popular song or any music, that you might want to think about some Creative Commons licensed music or royalty-free music. So that's the comment. Then my question is, again, going back to online courses, we're challenged very often when we link to research articles that are pertinent to the class. There's a danger of linking to something that's on the web. It might go away. And so I think that's made a lot of folks get in the habit of putting a PDF of a research article in a Canvas course, whether it's a face-to-face course or an online course. So my question is, what if, I think there are two things going on. Number one, if the journal has already made that article freely available, in other words, there no barriers to access, that's one thing, being able to link to it. But what if you have to subscribe to that journal? Let's say, all of the journals that we access, via the library database, what happens when you take an article from one of those journals and make it available in the course? Is that still fair use?
So yeah, that's tough. So a lot of our licenses with these databases deal with that question specifically, whether it's okay to download it and put it in Canvas and whether it's not. So it could be that for the particular thing you're talking about, you might need to talk to your subject librarian just to be sure one way or another. The safest thing is always to link and then provide a link and then have the student authenticate, log in, and access it that way. That's the safest thing, safer than providing that PDF. It's also possible, I think I mentioned, to find a lot of these articles will be available in institutional repositories of the authors. So that's often another good place to link to and to download from. Often, of course, it depends on the circumstances. But yeah, unfortunately, providing a link is safer. Generally speaking, link through the library so that student can sign in and authenticate.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So Kate, I think your answer may have covered some of the questions about, like what is the copyright rules for publishing resources on websites within like application portals so that are hidden behind sign-on. So that was one question that someone had, and so I think that it's always safer to link is kind of what you're saying there.
Yeah.
And then another question that came at the very beginning of the webinar was, and this is an interesting one because it's a new thing I think that people are dealing with, is what can people print in 3D printers?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. Well, I know that a lot of 3D printing files are available out there, totally open access. As far as stuff that isn't, it would really depend on the particular terms of the license or however that file was distributed. But I know there is a lot of stuff out there that is totally free to print in that way. But that's a great question, and it really just depends on the file that you're looking at.